One of the major unlocks for me when it comes to programming was actually stepping away from meta frameworks. When I first learned, I jumped in headfirst with Next.js, and it was great because it made me feel like I could do all of these things very easily. What I realized was when I was trying to solve certain problems, I was running into roadblocks because there were fundamentals underneath that I wasn't aware of. And the problem with meta frameworks is often they're kind of a black box. There are certain problems that they address and solve for you that if you find yourself outside of that framework, you don't even realize is something that you need to address because these things are built there. Walking away from Next.js for a little bit actually made me a much better full stack programmer because it allowed me to kind of have more hands-on and granular control over what happened between the front end and the back end of my code. And so for this video, what I want to do is put together my first tutorial, which is how do you create a tiny full stack app. I wanted to run it on the front end with React and TypeScript, and I'll do that through Vite. And on the back end, we're going to have an Express server. And so the idea here is that this is going to be the base project for a handful of tutorials that I'm going to do. And I kind of want to branch it off into a choose your own adventure kind of thing. So from here, we'll start with just the application itself. We'll build out the client directory. We'll build out the server directory. And then I'll probably jump off to a handful of different routes, I guess. One might be TRPC. I might not implement that in this initial video, but show you how you would implement that. Another is going to be how to take that application and then deploy it to Vercel, because I think for a lot of people, especially somebody who might be really interested in this video, you're probably seeing a lot of this on your timelines and you want to be able to deploy to Vercel. And it's a slightly different process through the READMEs. And I think they put out like a fix for this, but I'm not too sure what setups are compatible with that fix or not. So I'm just going to show you the way that I've been doing it before they implemented any fixes in case you run into any issues. And I think I'd love to also get in Supabase and how to use that for local development. So here's the first video. We're going to put together a simple full stack application with a React front end and an Express backend. Here we go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make our directory. So I'm going to make dir, we'll just do React Express. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is open up the app. I just created React Express, so we're going to cd into React Express, and then from there we're going to open up VS Code. So there are going to be two sides to this application. It's going to be the client side and the server side, and this is really important because it allows you to kind of isolate the dependencies, and it just makes things a little bit easier to maintain with a fair enough level of separation, right? So first thing we're going to do here, that's Command J to open up the terminal here. And so this puts us in the directory we're in right now. And here we're going to make two directories. One is going to be client, and the other is going to be server. And then we're going to cd into the client directory. So Vite is what I use by default. I think back in the day, this would have been a situation where a lot of people would have reached for a create React app. Vite is really light. It's really fast. I'm going to be using it with React and TypeScript. And so here we go. So we just copy that. We're going to run some of the setup from the command line. So Vite create latest, and we're just going to use this dot to say, just make sure you do it at the root right here, since we're already in the client directory. Need to install the following packages. Yes. React, TypeScript, and SWC. Use roll down beat. No. Install npm and start now. Yes. Okay, so now that everything's fully installed, we should have our React front end running on port 5173, and we do have that. Okay, so our next stop in the process is actually going to be to jump into our server-side code. Right now, we don't have anything in there, but what we're going to do to bring up this server is we're going to use Express to actually bring up the server. We're going to use NodeMon to watch for any changes within our server files so it can reload automatically the server so we don't have to shut it down and bring it back up every single time we make a change, and a couple of other small dependencies in there, like TS Node, for instance. So first thing we're going to do here is install Express. Let's do TS Node and NodeMon. Oh, wait. That's actually not where we want to do it. So we want to cd into server. And then once we're there, then boom. So this is going to do the installs for us. We'll see everything kind of pop out in here. Node modules, which is a lot. And for right now, all we have is the package JSON and our node modules from our installs. So first thing we're going to want to do is make a new directory for our source code. And then in there, we're going to create our index.ts file. And now that we have that, first thing we're going to do is import Express from Express. We don't need any of those things. We're going to bring up the app. We don't have a port in the env file because we don't have an env file, so this will just default it to 3000. You can have one in there if you want to, but for right now we'll just keep it simple. We'll have a simple hello world at the root, and then we're going to listen at port 3000 for this. So the first thing right here is we're getting these issues because we need types for Express. We're just going to install those really quickly. And then the other thing we need is our tsconfig file. So we can create our tsconfig.json. And then from there, and I just copied this, it's pretty standard stuff. We're essentially saying right here, this needs to change. So we're going to make the root directory right where we are. And then from there, we're going to include everything in our source directory. And that should calm everything. We now have the types, and the next thing we need to do is actually come in here and create the scripts. So we're not really focusing on start right now. I'm just going to leave that as is, but it did write the dev script correctly, which is to say we're going to use NodeMon and we're going to watch for all of the TS files that are within the source directory, and then we're going to execute TS Node for the index, which is where our server is running. And so now that we have all of those, we should be able to, let me just make sure we saved here. I think we're good. Yeah. Now that we have all of that, we should be able to, from here, say npm run dev. And once we do, we are now running on localhost 3000, and you'll see hello world back here. And so what we have now, and one of the reasons that we use NodeMon and we're watching right here, is because NodeMon is going to look for any changes to any files that end in TS within this directory and restart the server whenever we make a change there. So if we say hello sum of the world and we save, you notice that the server is automatically restarted, and you won't see it here because this is client side, but the second we reload, then we have our updated code. And so once we have everything connected and the front end and the back end are together for one another, when we make changes there, we should get all of the updates that we actually intend to get. So this is how we hook up the server side. And now we have a clean separation between our client side code, which has our React app running with Vite, and our server side code, which has our Express server. And these are the basics, right? So the next step is, how do we connect these two? And that's where we start getting into server proxies. So we connect the React front end to the server backend. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about server proxy. Server proxy is a piece of this that is absolutely not necessary. I like to use it as a cleaner kind of syntax for what I'm fetching, and here's what I mean. If you are starting off, you're probably doing something like this, where you're creating a use effect, you're creating an asynchronous function, and you're calling it. In this instance, this is an immediately invoked function expression. But if you could imagine, this is no different than saying, hey, const fetch data equals asynchronous function. You run the same thing, and then you would just run the function below here. So this is essentially saying, hey, I want you to go to localhost 3000, right, which should be running on our server side. and go to the hello endpoint, what we should be getting back is a JSON object with a message that says hello, hello, hello. So let's take a look at that from the front end. When we go into our console, we get back our message, and that's great. So one of the things that I would probably important here is there are kind of two approaches to writing your server layer, right? Maybe this server layer should only interact with the application, the front end, and maybe you're writing like a full backend because people should be able to fetch resources for this, at which case you build in authentication and so and so. If that is not the case and you are just connecting it to the front end, depending on what your setup might be like, you might get here and you might see a message that's related to cores. And what that means is you're having an issue with cross-origin resources, right? So the reason that's happening, or might be happening, is because your app, your front-end code is running on port 5173, but your server is running on 3000. And depending on your setup, you might run into an issue where it's like, hey, you shouldn't be able to access any of this. If you want to lock that down a bit, what you can do is just run install cores. And you might need to install the type for cores, but you'll be able to do that here. And you can import cores from cores. If you see red marks here and it's in regards to types, you'll probably need to get the types for cores. But you should see that message here once you hover on the red lines. And then from here, we're just going to say app.use cores, and we want express JSON. And so what you can do is, if you absolutely want to lock it down, you can say, hey, let's only allow things that originate from 5173, and that's an easy way to lock it out to not be able to be accessed for anything that you don't explicitly state. But let's talk about proxy. So what proxy allows you to do is, instead of explicitly saying, hey, why don't you go out to http/3000, you never, obviously this might change and you want to keep these variables maybe in like a shared space, but it might be nice that instead of doing this every time, we could just do this. And then we write our endpoints in accordance, right? So /API/hello/API/goodbye. And that way we have a very clean abstraction for how it is that we're fetching. Anything /API should direct us to our server, which is very different than if we were, let's say, using React Router and we were going to /home. We wouldn't want /home to be reaching for the server, right? We'd want /home to be reaching for React Router on the front end. And so this is how we're able to say, okay, whenever we write anything that starts with /API, I'm actually saying send that to the backend. And so the way that we can do that is to go into the vconfig file, and we can create the server proxy. And you don't necessarily just need to do it as a string, because you also have options here, and you can do something like this. And I do not believe we need to do this, but I think the change origin should be fine. And then what this means is whenever we write any calls that start with /API, what I'm actually saying is, do me a favor and take that to 3000. And so I think the rewrite path here means that we replace /API with nothing, which means that without this rewrite, you'd essentially be writing. Well, let's take a look. So you do this, and right now you're able to still get your messages. And the reason this is happening is because we rewrote the path, and we're replacing anything that starts with API with blank, so that we actually don't need to change anything about the way we have our code here, because now /API/hello just takes us to here. If you do it without that regex, what you actually end up having to do is do this for each one. So you probably want to keep that clean, and then that is a good reason why we should be rewriting it here. But with this little bit of code now, what happens is now we're no longer fetching directly from 3000, because if we look in our network, now we're actually fetching and saying, hey, we just take this straight from the front end and reroute that, right? So we're essentially rewriting that endpoint. And this allows us to then, from here forward, instead of saying, hey, fetch from HTTP localhost 3000 every single time we need to fetch resources, we're actually just able to say /API/ whatever the endpoint is, and we get the benefit of keeping everything super clean back here by just writing what the endpoint is. And I'd like to keep this here as like the base for what's coming next. There are a lot of tools that beginners end up using, and it seems really exciting and fun. And honestly, sometimes it's really easy to get lost. For this, I'm going to use this as the base, but I'm going to be launching kind of a choose your own adventure series here. And some of the things that I want to focus on are things that I think beginners are often using. Those things specifically being TRPC. If you don't know, it's one of my favorite things to use, and I think it's a great way to kind of look at it against writing out regular HTTP endpoints. I think deploying to Vercel can sometimes be an issue with a setup like this because you need to do a little bit of manual code in order to make Vercel acknowledge how your app is being launched and different commands. And then I think another thing I want to focus on here is actually Supabase. Supabase is a backend as a service that allows you to use Postgres, but there's built-in authentication and stuff like that. And it's definitely one of the tools that I am excited to use. I use Supabase all of the time, but it does abstract a lot, right? And so I want to create a walkthrough on how to set up local environments there, which are a little bit confusing and are a lot different than what the production process might look like. But this is the basis right here. And so all of these projects, you'll be able to essentially start from here and then choose your own adventure from there. So this is the base, and I'll see you again soon with some breakdowns for you to choose from on whether or not you want to check out TRPC and how that differs from just using HTTP, if you want to use Supabase in local environments, and if you want to be able to deploy to Vercel very easily with a custom setup like this, as opposed to something that is just laid out from their initial config. So, yep, see you soon.